Hey, we're back with chapter 2 this week. I'm ditching Mr. Darcy, and last week we did chapter 1, and it was super fun to talk about it on Facebook, and I can't wait to do it again this week because this one's fun. It has a really, probably one of my favorite characters in the entire book is in this one, so I can't wait to talk about it. So anyway, we're going to dive right in with chapter 2. Ready? Here we go. Okay. Elizabeth was awakened bright and early by the shrill voice of Bruno Mars in her ear, belting out Uptown Funk on repeat. Abruptly falling off the couch, she grabbed at the air blindly until her hand closed around her cell phone. She made a mental note to change her ringer immediately, as she would now forever associate that song with the feeling of utter humiliation after the previous evening, and attempted to focus on the name on the screen. It was her sister Jane, calling from England where she lived with their aunts. "Hello, Jane," she said hoarsely. "Happy New Year, Lizzie." Pulling her phone away from her ear to look at the time, she squinted at the numbers until they unscrambled in front of her bleary eyes. "It's 6 a.m, Jane, for God's sake." "Is it? Oops. It's 11 here, so I completely forgot." "Oh well, my curiosity is more important than your sleep. So how was last night?" Elizabeth heaved a large sigh and rubbed her eyes with the back of her hand. "You mean my date with Brian?" she asked wearily. "How big is the ring? Did he get down on one knee? What did you say? Is he moving in? Are you going to call Mom and Dad? When's the wedding?" Jane managed to squeeze out in one breath. "I don't know, Jane. Maybe you should ask James." Elizabeth yawned and rolled over. "What? James? Who the heck's James?" "Brian's boyfriend. He told me last night that he was in love with him." Elizabeth could feel a lump forming in her throat. "That's a joke, right? You've got to be kidding me, right?" Jane exclaimed. "Oh, it's not a joke. Unless you're referring to our entire relationship, which definitely was." Elizabeth sighed. "It's completely over, Jane. I rang in the New Year here alone, watching a stupid Pride and Prejudice DVD and crying into my ice cream. Oh my God, I'm going to kill him. I'm literally going to hop on a plane right now, hunt him down, and kill him with my bare hands," Jane shouted into the phone. "As satisfying as that would be to watch," Elizabeth replied with a smirk, "I'm going to be fine. Really. I just need to get him out of my head. Time to dust off my book, I guess. At least I'll always have Mr. Darcy, right?" "Oh, Lizzie, for heaven's sake, when are you going to give up on that book? Mr. Darcy's not only unobtainable, he's completely fictional. You are in love with an imaginary man. Don't you think it's time to move on? Find someone real?" "I did that, Jane. I found John and Henry and Frank, plus a few other names not even worth mentioning, and then Brian. The problem is that real men are horrible jerk faces that break your heart." Elizabeth felt her eyes began to well up and wiped them with her sleeve. "Do you ever think that maybe you're searching for the wrong kind of man?" Jane asked. "You keep looking for someone that reminds you of Mr. Darcy, but maybe Mr. Darcy isn't the right guy for you, Lizzie." "Jane, Mr. Darcy is the right guy for everyone. He is literally the epitome of the perfect man. He has been every woman's fantasy since Jane Austen wrote him into existence 200 years ago. Why shouldn't I strive to find someone who is the present-day version of him? Honestly, I don't see what the big deal is with Mr. Darcy anyway," Jane muttered. "He's extremely stuck up, not to mention emotionally constipated. I always thought Mr. Bingley was much more appealing. Happy-go-lucky, loves to party. Maybe you should find somebody like that." "Jane," Elizabeth cried, exasperated. "Please, just let me have this. I promise I won't end up a crazy cat lady. I just know what I want, and what I want is to immerse myself in the fantasy that is Mr. Darcy until I find someone who comes as close to him as possible." She paused. "Someone who isn't gay, that is." "Maybe Mr. Darcy is what you want, but he might not be what you need," Jane replied. "Maybe you should open up to the idea that there are other types of men out there that might fulfill you in a way that you never thought of before. Maybe someone who isn't perfect would actually be perfect for you." Elizabeth knew nothing she said could make her sister understand. She decided to remain silent. Look, why don't you come to London for a while? Stay with me and Aunt Tessa and Aunt Bridget. You can get your mind off of Brian and maybe even meet someone. God knows the best men are from England anyway. Just ask Mom. Jane said excitedly. Oh yeah? Elizabeth asked playfully. Found anyone recently who has lasted more than a week, have you? I, unlike you, do not feel the need to settle down with Mr. Wright. I am perfectly happy being single. And dating lots of different guys, Jane replied confidently. Confidently? Yeah, well, maybe you're onto something. Seriously, come. I would love to spend time with my baby sis, Jane pleaded. You know, my lease is up in a month. Maybe I could ask my boss if he would mind if I worked remotely for a while. Everyone else seems to be doing that. Do they have Wi-Fi in England? Elizabeth joked. Yes, this is amazing. I'll pay for half of your plane ticket to help you out. I'm so excited right now. You're going to love London. It's the perfect place to forget about that total get Brian. Wow, you have completely gone over to the dark side, haven't you? You know you're originally from Philly, right? Elizabeth laughed. Oh, there's more where that came from, Lizzie. Don't forget our own father is from Surrey. I'm half British and so are you. Now, speaking of Dad, you better get over there and tell them the new plan. They will be so happy that you have finally come to your senses and are going to find a real man in England. Yeah, it should be a barrel of laughs to tell them about Brian. Mom never liked him to begin with. She's going to gloat like nobody's business. Elizabeth sighed. Let her. She lives for that sort of thing. Besides, in a month, you will be here with me, and all your belongings will be cluttering up her garage. That can be your payback, Jane chuckled. Elizabeth felt a flood of love for her sister wash over her as she watched a patch of early morning sunlight stretch across the floor. This could be a completely new beginning for me. I don't know why I didn't think to look for my Mr. Darcy in England in the first place. Okay, I'll do it. I'll come to live with you in England. Yay! I'm going to call you in a week to make plans. Oh, and I'm going to find someone to set you up with. I know lots of super nice blokes, Lizzie. And give Brian back his DVD. I will buy you a signed copy from the Colin Firth gift shop down the street, ballin' like Colin. It's not his actual signature, but I think it's his sister's ex-husband's neighbor from childhood signed it for him. So it's practically the same thing. Yeah, that's okay, Jane. I don't really care for the Colin Firth version anyway. The movie version with Matthew McFadden is so much better, Elizabeth replied. No way, you better not say that in London. Colin is practically a deity over here. That's not even the only shop dedicated to him, you know. There's another one for What It's Firth, near my work. I can't believe you would even say you like the movie version better. That is such blasphemy. Besides, the wet shirt scene, that has got to be one of the greatest moments in cinematic history. I get goosebumps just thinking about how smoking hot he is. Jane exhaled loudly into the phone. Elizabeth sighed and buried her head in a pillow. 1 week later, Elizabeth was driving to her parents' house 1 hour outside of Philadelphia to tell them about the move. As she sipped her mocha frap, she thought about how they had met and fell in love. It was a truly romantic story, one that would have made Jane Austen proud. Her mother, Mary Ann, had taken every penny she had saved after finishing college and bought a plane ticket to London. An avid Austen fan herself, she planned to find a respectable job, a modest yet attractive flat with a low monthly rent, and most importantly, a man. She had always dreamed of living in England and imagined the stately manners and abbeys of Austen's novels as her future, complete with her own Mr. Darcy. What she found, however, was a low-paying job at an Indian restaurant and a one-bedroom flat in a bad part of town. A year later, after a discouraging day of scooping turkey curry into disposable containers, she decided to take a drive. Half an hour in, she came upon a quaint little pub with a vine-covered brick exterior, flower boxes under the windows, and a hanging plaque with a bird perched on a branch. It was seemingly out of place among the more modern buildings that surrounded it, and she suddenly felt compelled to go inside. Sitting on the closest stool, she slumped forward with her chin in her hand and gazed down the bar. Her heart did a somersault in her chest as she saw the most handsome man she had ever seen, sitting at the very end, staring sadly into his beer. He repeatedly ran his fingers through the messy brown hair that curled behind his ears and brushed the stubble on his rugged jaw. He looked up at that exact moment with his pale blue eyes and caught her staring, gaping really, and smiled. Electricity surged between them. Before they knew it, they were chatting as if they had known each other forever. His name was Henry, he lived in Surrey, and he worked in London as the CEO of a large company. He had recently gotten divorced from his wife of 3 years, who had left him for his best friend. It had been a particularly depressing day. Moments before entering the pub, he had opened his mail to find her wedding ring inside of an otherwise empty envelope. Marianne felt truly sorry for him. In an attempt to sympathize, she told him all about her failed hopes and dreams. By the time the bar was closing, Marianne left for home with his number in her pocket, plans for a dinner date the next day, and an entirely new dream. A whirlwind romance began, with Marianne moving in with him after only 6 weeks of dating. He found her a great job at his company, and both were completely head over heels in love. A year had gone blissfully by when Marianne received disastrous news from home. Her mother had been diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer and was dying. Her father begged her to come back home to be with her for the end. She knew she had to go. Telling the love of her life that she had to leave him was the hardest thing she ever had to do. They spent their last evening together, crying in each other's arms, both unable to say goodbye. He drove her to the airport the next day, and before she boarded the plane, he begged her to let him come with her. With tears streaming down her face, she told him that she could not be selfish. She could not allow him to throw away his career and leave his family and life in England for her. With all the strength she could muster, she kissed him and walked away without looking back. A few days later, she was going through some medical bills when she heard a knock at the door of her parents' house. She opened the door, and there stood Henry, looking exhausted but handsome as ever. He had left everything to be with her. They were married 1 week later, at her mother's bedside, as her last wish had been to see her only daughter's wedding. A few years later, their first daughter was born. Marianne thought it only fitting to name her Jane, for her favorite author. Another couple of years, and they were blessed with a second daughter, Elizabeth, for the heroine of Pride and Prejudice. It was Marianne who gave the cherished copy of their favorite book, passed down through the generations, to Elizabeth on her birthday so many years before. Inside the cover was the inscription, "To my beloved daughter, may you find your own perfect happiness." Elizabeth treasured her gift, the symbol of a real-life happy ending. As she parked and walked toward the front door of the house, Elizabeth was filled with apprehension about how her parents would handle the news of her new adventure. On one hand, she knew they would be glad for her to spend time with her sister and her 2 aunts, both of whom she had last seen as a young girl. On the other hand, her mother would lose her weekly opportunities to give her overbearing opinion on every aspect of her daughter's life over lunch. No matter how old Elizabeth became, even now at the ripe age of 27, her mother had the uncanny knack for making her feel like the child she apparently still wished she was. Even her nickname made her cringe slightly. "Lizzie the Ladybug! I've been waiting at the window for half an hour. What took you so long?" her mother squealed as she pulled her inside. She stood on tippy toes to smother her daughter in a tight hug, her salt and pepper bob tickling Elizabeth's nose, along with the aroma of her Chanel No. 5. As she held her daughter at arm's length, Elizabeth couldn't help but smile back at her. Even though she was well past middle age, her mother was still strikingly beautiful. Her skin was luminous and smooth, with hardly a wrinkle to be seen. Her eyes were bright blue, enhanced by her immaculate application of makeup, which included perfectly arched brows and ruby red lips. She wore pearls around her neck and in her ears, furthering her illusion of the perfect housewife. It was an ambition that Elizabeth felt she could never amount to, and one that she knew her mother would always be disappointed in her for not achieving as she had done. "Traffic, Mom, you know how it can be leaving the city," Elizabeth replied patiently. "I'm gonna make some tea. You still take it with 2 sugars, right? Have you said hello to your father yet?" "No, Mom, I just walked in the door." She sat down at the table. "How is that sycophant, Brian? Has he proposed yet?" her mother asked bluntly as she left to put the kettle on. "Yep, that took about as long as I thought it would." "No, Mom, we actually broke up last week." "No," exclaimed her mother in mock surprise. "He was so..." "Nope, can't do it. He was the worst. I always knew you could do better. What happened? Did you finally realize he was completely fake? Did you dump him? Well, to be honest, he dumped me. But you are right. He was completely fake. Our entire relationship was. I'm just glad it's over now, so I can move on. Elizabeth replied, carefully scanning her mother's face for her reaction. Oh, yes, you definitely should. There are plenty of better men out there. You will find one, sweetie, her mother said patronizingly, patting her hand. Although it would be nice if you would find one sooner rather than later. Then I might get the chance to plan a wedding and have grandchildren before I die. Yeah, about that. Where's Dad anyway? Elizabeth asked, looking around the room. He's out back shoveling the patio, even though no one sets foot out back in the winter. He's always finding some useless chore to keep him busy instead of staying inside to talk to me. I'll go get him. Her mother sighed dramatically as she left the room. Elizabeth grinned at the thought of her father preferring to spend time in the freezing cold than to listen to her mother's incessant chatter about absolutely nothing. She knew better than to think anything of it, however. Even after 32 years of marriage, he was still crazy about her, despite her more irritating qualities. Still, no one can blame him for choosing to admire her with a wall between them on occasion. Her mother came back into the room, followed by her father, who grinned as he wrapped her in a bear hug. Hi, Dad, Elizabeth said faintly, her nose flattened against his chest. How's the patio coming along? Oh, you know, Lizzie, it is a job that requires lots of time and patience. These things can't be rushed if you want them done right, her father replied, his blue eyes twinkling as he gave her a wink. He took off his jacket to reveal a Hawaiian print shirt. Elizabeth covered her mouth with her hand to hide her smile. Lizzie was just about to tell me about her latest love interest, weren't you, Lizzie? Her mother asked as she poured the tea. What? What happened to Brian? Is he not around anymore then? Her father asked. No, I'm done with him, Dad. He broke up with me for someone else. A man, actually, which is the humiliating part. Elizabeth sighed. No kidding, her father replied. I would never have guessed it. I'm not a bit surprised, actually, her mother said smugly. Isn't he the one who dressed like Colin Firth for Halloween? When every other man buys that horrid cow costume with the giant udders? I mean, sheesh, shouldn't he have seen that coming, sweetie? He was dressed as Mr. Darcy, Mom. There are more Pride and Prejudice adaptations than just the one with Colin Firth, you know. Elizabeth began picking at her cuticles. Not that it matters at all. It most certainly does, her mother muttered distractedly as she stirred her tea. Colin is the only Mr. Darcy worth watching, if you ask me. Come to think of it, he would make a wonderful son-in-law, she gasped. Maybe you should contact him, see if he's single. Elizabeth bit her lip and stared determinedly into her teacup. Funny you should say that, dear, her father said with another wink at Elizabeth. I always got the impression that Firth bloke was gay, isn't he? Elizabeth felt her confidence rise as she smiled gratefully at her father. Anyway, I talked to Jane a few days ago. She convinced me to come stay with her, Aunt Tessa, and Aunt Bridget for a while. I'm leaving in a few weeks. Isn't that great? She smiled hopefully at her parents, who stared blankly back. Then her father cleared his throat. Honey, that sounds perfect. You deserve to go out into the world and have an adventure of your own. I just wish I was coming with you. Elizabeth's mother gave a shriek of protest. Excuse me? Her father laughed and pulled her toward him in a tight squeeze. He made a face at Elizabeth over her head. Of course I meant both of us, my darling angel. After successfully gaining her mother's blessing, by managing to convince her that the entire plan was her idea, Elizabeth returned home. On her way inside the building, she grabbed her mail, felt her heart skip a beat as she saw Brian's name on a crisp white envelope addressed to Miss Elizabeth Baker. She hesitated, then ripped it open quickly to discover it was an invitation to his wedding. The feeling that registered as she read the words Mr. Brian Matthews and Mr. James Carter request the honor of your presence was surprisingly not heartache, but The happy realization that in that moment, at least, she harbored no resentment toward the two of them whatsoever. With a feeling of absolute freedom, she made her way up the stairs to her apartment. Kicking off her sneakers one at a time, she strolled over to the freezer to grab some ice cream out of habit. She smiled at the container of Cherry Garcia and threw it back in. She didn't need comfort food. She was feeling nothing short of invincible at the moment. She pulled on her pajama pants with the pink bunny pattern and turned on the television, searching for Pandora Radio with the remote. She rolled her eyes as she immediately recognized the song Just a Girl by No Doubt. How appropriate. She fleetingly imagined Brian kissing her and wishing she was James instead, then pushed the idea from her head. She was so over it. Turning the volume all the way up on the speakers, she grabbed the handle of the broom that was leaning up against the wall, using it as a microphone as she sang along at the top of her lungs. She hopped onto the coffee table as the song reached its crescendo. By the way, I do this all the time, like every day. So, and do other people do this, or is it just me? Let me know. I do it all the time. Belting out the chorus, she waved her arms dramatically and threw her long hair around, head banging to the beat. Then she leapt off the table and slid across the floor on her knees, playing air guitar. Totally do that. All the time. Suddenly there was a loud knocking sound, and she immediately stopped singing in surprise. Breathing hard, with her hair sticking out in every direction, she opened the door. Standing on the threshold was the pizza delivery guy. Oh, right. I ordered a pizza on the way home. "Hey, Kyle," she said breezily, crossing her arms and leaning against the door frame. Her shoulder missed slightly, and she flinched as she caught herself. "Long time no see, Lizzie," Kyle replied with a grin. "I was beginning to think you didn't love me anymore." He smiled again, the gap in his front teeth momentarily distracting her from his finger in a light socket hair. He pushed his horn-rimmed glasses further up on his long nose. "Yes, well, I have recently seen the error of my ways. My heart beats only for you, Kyle. You and that beautiful circle of cheesy goodness in the box you're holding." Elizabeth handed him the money and took the pizza from him. "Boyfriend troubles?" he asked, taking in her disheveled appearance. He looked past her at the television, which was now playing Rolling in the Deep. "Gay," Elizabeth replied candidly, still holding the box and ripping into a slice with her teeth. Kyle grimaced. "Yeah, I always thought that about him." He looked at Elizabeth, who was staring at him, completely nonplussed. "Well, I better get going. You were my last delivery. Gotta get back to the dungeon." Elizabeth's lips twitched. "Your mother's basement?" "World of Warcraft." "Oh, yes. Did you achieve the highest mythic keystone yet?" Elizabeth bit her lip to keep from smiling. If I do, I will win $100,000. Then I will quit this godforsaken job, and we won't have these romantic rendezvous anymore." Kyle replied with a dramatic sigh. She looked him up and down his considerable frame, tilting her head to one side. "Well, if this is our last date, you should at least help me finish this pizza." "Can we watch that movie you always have on in the background when I deliver? I'm dying to know what happens with that girl and that guy with the sideburns." Elizabeth grinned. Yes, please. Come on in." She stepped aside so he could enter. Before she made her way into the kitchen to grab 2 sodas from the fridge, she popped the DVD into the player. They sat down on the couch, and as she turned and gave him an excited smile, she pushed aside the feeling that inviting the pizza guy in to watch her favorite movie was probably considered pathetic. At least Kyle seemed to be enjoying it as much as she was. Or so she thought, until he turned to look at her after 45 minutes and said, "So when does Colin Firth show up?" "From now on, I'm ordering Chinese." That's it. Chapter 2. Next week, we're going to do chapter 3, and oh my goodness, chapter 3. The best. I can't even wait. I'm so excited. So, we'll see you then.